thanks for all being here. Just as by way of background, again, my name is Clint Ray. I manage institutional and channel relationships here at Benzinga. And I get the opportunity to speak with people like Zeke and Eliza and Greg. And I'm very mindful of their time when I do get to speak with them. And but some of the questions that I'm not able to talk to them about during my general 20 or 30 minutes of an introductory call are some things that I really wanted to deep dive into a little bit. So some things about some of their procurement processes, how they might utilize data, how they work with different data vendors, and some best practices. And so I thought that we might use the next 25 minutes or so to really dive into some of those questions for the benefit of both vendors and the buy side, how to just both work with each other a little bit more effectively. I guess as further background, I've worked with Greg and Eliza here at Benzinga, but also worked with Jump and Bali Osni in the past in different roles and worked through the data procurement process. I've known and I've also listened to Eliza and Greg at industry conferences and just really appreciated their candor and transparency during explaining some of these processes. Zeke and I I met Zeke about 15 years ago, evaluating some low latency data, and we've developed a really great friendship over the years. And he's been very candid and open about some of his evaluation of some of our data sets, and it's been incredibly helpful. So with that, I thought that we might be just a quick introduction from each of you. If you can just maybe reintroduce yourself, a little bit of a background, where you're from, and then broadly describe some of your data acquisition processes.
Cool. As Clint said, my name's Zeke. I run about a 30-person prop trading group that mostly does high-frequency relative value arbitrage. I've been a client Clint's one off and on for about 15 years for some of his data sets. And I'll turn it over to Eliza.
Okay, thanks, Zeke. Hi, I'm Eliza Raphael. I run our data strategy at Jump Trading. We are a systematic and across a lot of different time horizons, mostly known as high frequency futures trading, but we've really expanded into low frequency and some mid frequency and a few other time horizons, like I said, across all asset classes globally. So my team is responsible for sourcing all of the data that we use at the firm, whether it's exchange data, market data, reference data, and alternative data.
And I'm Greg Kurzman. I'm on the data sourcing and strategy team at Baliazzi Asset Management. We're about a $28 billion hedge fund based out of Chicago. True multi-strat, long-short equities, systematic, macro fixed income, equity arb, and commodities. On the data sourcing and strategy team, we manage and source all the third-party data and research relationships used across our investment teams. And we play matchmaker with our investment teams and data and research vendors to help drive alpha for our investment teams, managing both kind of the commercially available data sources. And we spend a lot of our time proactively sourcing differentiated data that's not actively being sold in the market.
And Eliza, what would be an example of maybe an ideal vendor interaction from contact to evaluation?
A wish list time. Okay. I mean, I think it starts with, some sort of general outreach, which we are open to at any point, and really just understanding the product and what problem you're trying to solve with your data. How do you compare to other similar products in the market? Why should I read more and learn more about it? And I think being as concise as possible in that outreach is really important, right? I can probably speak for the three of us here and the amount of emails that we get that are sort of cold, ideas sent our way. So trying to be, as broad but as specific as possible, so that in the 3 minutes it takes to read your email, I can quickly understand, is this going to be valuable and worth more exploration, or is it not? And then from that point, usually we engage in a trial if there's some interest, whether it's interest generated by my team where we think there is going to be a use case, or interest brought to us by one of our research teams. And, the trial can run anywhere. The time frame kind of depends on the structure of the data, how complicated it is, how easy it is to get in-house. Does it need to be mapped to tickers, so on and so forth. 3 months is about the standard time frame, I'd say, for a trial. Throughout that period, we try to provide as much feedback as we can and insight into what we're finding in the data. We usually have some questions on collection methods or timestamps or field definitions. And then commercials. That's sort of how it goes. I think, I don't know what the industry numbers are, but the amount of data sets that we trial to how many we actually buy is a very low percentage. So don't be disappointed if we don't buy it. We may come back again because inevitably you say no, and then 3 months later somebody comes to you and says, do you know a data set that does X? And you're like, oh yes, we just turned that one down. Let's take a look at it again. So, just continue to engage.
Yeah. And then, so Greg, when a new vendor reaches out to you, are there some basic requirements that you would ask for in order to even take a look at the data? Are there some just basic elements or tagging that Balyasny would require?
Not necessarily on the tagging and enrichment side. If that's not something that's available from the vendor in their productized data set, it's something that we can always enrich on our end. So that's never a needle mover necessarily for us. We want to make sure that the vendor has the rights to redistribute the data. Compliance is going to be the first step of any process that we go through. So to kind of get past that hurdle of compliance, we want to make sure that you guys own, the data vendor owns the data and has the right to sell some type of derivative product, especially in the financial services market. And that's kind of in your T's and C's. But yes, if you have back tests for specific KPIs or tickers already done, that's always helpful for us to have as well, because there may be data that we don't, or certain strategies or tickers that we don't have great signal on, where we want to enhance those signals by bringing in new data sets. So any kind of work that's been done on the back end to show, hey, this can be useful for an equity or systematic strategy because of these back tests are always helpful for us to have.
The other thing I'd say, can I add one more thing, is documentation, right? All kinds of documentation, whether it's your data dictionary, any marketing documents that you have that will help us understand what you're trying to do with your data, back tests, as you said, sample data, all of those things are really valuable at the onset so that we have a complete picture. Because inevitably what happens is we have the conversation with a researcher, and those are the first things they ask us is, can you show me the data dictionary? Can you give me a sample? How much history is there? What's the coverage? So on and so forth. And so having all of that makes the first conversation so much more fruitful, as opposed to me having to go back and forth piecemeal with the vendor to get all of those pieces of information. At that point, the researcher may have already moved on to something else.
And I don't think BAM is unique in this sense, but we have a large data repository, data catalog that's a self-service tool for all of the firm to use. So as we get new documentation, we put them up internally. That way it's always there for somebody to view. They don't have to come to me to ask the questions. They can kind of just comb through our library essentially and see all the latest documentation on a given data set.
Yeah, it's helpful. And I think that Zeke, and you're obviously Jump and Balyasny are larger organizations and a data procurement process. But from your side, when you start to have these initial conversations with salespeople, and you might not have the bandwidth to take every single call, how do you, how do you prioritize from some of the data sets that you're looking at, but also what type of product knowledge are you requiring, or would you request from the vendor so that you don't have a lot of back and forth?
Yeah, that's a good question, because a lot of our initial sales calls end up with, oh, I have to go back and ask engineering. But that's not true for every potential vendor. For instance, as a high frequency trading firm, we're often buying data because it's low latency. So there was a couple different data products we were looking at that involved sending shortwave data from Chicago to Tokyo, bounce it off the ionosphere and get it there 10 milliseconds faster than over fiber. And one firm, for instance, said, we can get the data there 10 milliseconds faster. This is our number. the throughput, it arrives 75% of the time. The other firm had different data. They said when there is a 10-tick move or more in the S&P 500 down, we will then get a signal of that move to Tokyo 10 milliseconds faster, and our throughput is 73%. And there's a big difference between those two things, because basically the radio spectrum gets jammed up with signals when the markets are busy, and the throughput of certain signals drops a lot. And one vendor knew exactly what we needed to know ahead of time. In the case of the other vendor, they were like, yeah, here's a 2-month trial. But although we were getting it free for 2 months, we still had to spend 2 months of engineering time to discover that their throughput was really 25%. So when the engineering team is involved in the sales pitch and has really specific numbers, it saves us a lot of time, and it saves the vendor a lot of time, because we're not going to, if their product's not useful to us, we're not going to do the trial, waste their time and ours. And so the more they can give us specific numbers straight from the engineering team, and the initial sales pitch, the better it is.
So you would prefer more of a technical salesperson that might have more knowledge. And
I think that any of the salespeople we speak to can learn these concepts easily. That's not rocket science, but sometimes certain vendors are a little bit they don't want to broadcast certain data. They're reluctant. They're a little paranoid of doing these types of measurements, or they don't want to do the research to measure these things themselves. For instance, we don't use any external software now, but 10 years ago we did. And two different trading firms would say our tick to trade time is 15 microseconds for options, and then another firm would say, well, our time is 10 microseconds 99% of the time, but in the 1 percentile times our average is 14. And the difference between when you have those two different types of numbers, one basically gives you the number of during busy markets, what the 1 percentile time is, and the other one's giving you a median, and their system would jam up during busy markets. So I think that the salespeople can be given a dossier of really technical data and have it in front of them and then present that, and it'll just save everyone a lot of time.
So then, Eliza, how as a Zeke's and utilizing the data himself, so he's going to understand a lot of the intricacies of all these different data points. How do you convey some of that information when you might not know, right, the level of detail that a portfolio manager might know? So what does it look like at your firm when you come across a data set? And I'm thinking when Zeke's talking, unfortunately, that's a lot of information. I hope I'm taking a lot of notes, because now I have to go out and go find somebody that knows what I'm talking about. So how does it work at Jump in that situation?
I mean, it's different. It's different types of information, right? We're not. I mean, on our low latency side, we're more looking at exchange data, so it's pretty straightforward, or different. Maybe it's complicated in a different way. But on the alternative side, it's definitely just building the relationships with the portfolio managers, and okay, this team or this person is going to be very caught up in the history because their out of sample period is X and they really need the history to go back to Y, and it needs to have a certain amount of frequency so they have enough data points to really test it. And then this one might actually be more care about the coverage. And so, it's going to have more than 500 names for it to be relevant. And so you kind of learn the personalities of each of the different people you work with, and to sort of position a data set to them based on that. So I wouldn't bring to the person who needs the coverage to be at least 500 names, a very sector specific data set that covers 20 names. I'm not doing my job very well. And that's going to get up to somebody who's like, why is she bringing me this data set that's not valuable? So part of our job is really understanding our internal teams, what's important to them. And we really act as a filter to help vendors who have something interesting get it in front of the right people.
And then, so who generally is initiating those conversations? So in two scenarios, do you have an influx of vendors that are calling in and they're pitching new ideas, or do you have a demand that's coming in internally that are requesting data sets and then you go back out and find them? Greg?
We have both. We absolutely have both. There's certain types of data that we're always looking for and are always going to introduce it out to a specific team or strategy. However, there is PM demand, and a PM may have used a specific data set at his prior shop, and they're coming in and want to replicate that process. But there was kind of a black box model in terms of what they were doing in their last shop. So, based on what they describe, we'll go out and find it for them. But it certainly comes both ways. We love having the influx of data providers reach out to us, and keeping the repository fresh, and always knowing the latest and greatest that's out there. Our job is to get that in front of as many teams as possible, make them aware at least of what's going on in the industry. We send out like a monthly digest newsletter type of like themes we're seeing in the market, new data sets that we like and why we like them and how they're differentiated. So it's just a constant revolving door, I would say, of stuff that's coming in and demand that's being requested. But we try to be as proactive as possible when discussing these new type of data sets with our investment teams.
And is that pretty similar to what's going on at Jump? Is that a very similar environment?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty similar. I think that's probably pretty similar across the buy side of firms that have teams that are dedicated to data sourcing and strategy. I think that's really the value that these teams bring to the firms.
Yeah. So then you only consume a handful of data sets that you'll start reviewing. What do you feel the best practices for vendors when they're told that this is not of interest right now? And so Eliza, I can start with you, but I'm just curious that you've spent some time with a vendor, you've established a relationship, there's no interest right now. What kind of happens in the background?
I mean, I think we try to be as transparent as possible. Obviously, there's things we can say and there's things we can't say. There are probably things that we don't even know, that our researchers don't always tell us all of the reasons why. Sometimes a data set just isn't additive to their strategy. It doesn't mean it's a bad data set. It just means it's not adding anything additional. But as Greg said, we keep track of it. We know what the data is. And try to provide information to the vendor. And then we keep your contact information because like I said, you never know when a new team might come in and have a different type of strategy or have used this data and found a different use case for it. So I think, the relationships are long, and the sales cycle is long, but understand that, we all want the same thing, right? If your data is going to be additive, we're going to be aligned and trying to get it into our firm, into our hands as quickly as possible at a price that we all think is fair. And if it's not, we'll try and give you that information back as quickly as possible and with as much detail as we can.
Sure. And so Zeke, when you're working with some of these vendors, and I'm sure you get a lot of different inquiries. Is there anything that they might be able to do? And I know you mentioned it earlier, but before the initial reach out in terms of the additional examples, some more product knowledge, like any specific documents that you feel that they should be ready for before they even made a phone call with you?
Well, I can think of an interaction I had with one vendor, and actually a friend of mine in the trading community said, hey, I went to this talk that this radio network provider was giving, and they did a whole deep dive of some new change to the CME's market data feed. The CME had upgraded its feed and had slowed down certain messages, changed the granularity of timestamps on other ones, and they basically went and analyzed the differences in the feed. And then that was part of their talk. So they weren't giving away any customers, proprietary knowledge that had been shared with them. It's just they basically went and did a few months worth of engineering work for us. And, this information was relevant because they had to figure out, okay, I don't need to send the whole book across the oceans, but I need to look for this specific message, this large trade message that the CME is publishing. That's what I need to send. It comes at this time, compared to everything else. And, that was really helpful. And then it basically it led into the product they were selling. But it was also like, I want to go to their talks now because I'll learn something that I would have to just sort of do research on my own. Yeah. So there are things like that I think vendors can do. They can do their own research, not on non-public information, but just analyze other public information and put that out there, and then that can be a really good starting point to gain customers.
So then, Greg, similar question, but when you find that there's not interest in a data set, and the vendor obviously wants to stay in contact, but doesn't want to be overly aggressive, what would be some suggestions on a cadence of follow-up, or how would you prefer to be connected with?
Sure. I mean, anybody's, can put time in my calendar. I would say quarterly. If there's nothing new to catch up on, maybe we push it out a couple months. Let me know where you had good calls. Maybe like last quarter, your data was really good on a specific KPI. Let me know that. I may be looking for something very similar. Didn't even realize that, this vendor had coverage on it. So that's always helpful, but just stay transparent with me. Let me know if there's good adoption across the buy side. That's always a helpful data point for me. I don't want any specifics, but let me know, like, hey, there's a couple, 3 similar firms that started licensing, your data in the last quarter. That's helpful for me to know that, your data set is gaining traction. And we're always transparent as well. It's a partnership. That's, what we continue to say. We'll let you know, hey, in a couple months, I know we have a TMT PM coming in that's going to cover this specific area that I think your data is going to be useful for. Let's stay in touch. And it just works both ways. So just keeping the door open is extremely important.
And then if there's a vendor that reaches out and maybe their data isn't something that you can immediately consume, and Eliza, I guess I'm going to direct this question to you, is do you work with the vendor? If you find promise in some of the data, what are some ways that you might work with them in order to maybe take some of that data in-house and then test it yourselves?
I mean, I think especially with early stage vendors who maybe haven't been selling their data out yet, we're more than happy to help kind of cultivate a product with what's important to us, which is probably transferable to many other firms. I think if there's, if for example, you don't really know how to structure it, or you need help thinking about what are your use cases, we can try and help with that. But there's got to be something that we see in the data for it to be worth our time, right? It's going to take resources from us on our engineering side as well as our research side to sit down and figure out how we could make something out of this. And so if you're coming with a data set where maybe we already have 5 vendors that provide that and you're not bringing anything additive, that might not be an area that we would spend our time. But if this is something new, or you have a new take on it, or a new data point that's not been previously available, we'll absolutely work with you to try and help you bring that to market. And not just for us, because I think, it used to be probably 10 years ago, everybody wanted exclusives. Nobody wants exclusives anymore. Nobody wants to be the only one using your data. Zeke's looking at me. Maybe you do. Maybe you want the fastest data, but you don't want to be the only one using the data. There's a lot of risk inherent. I think compliance teams have become less comfortable with that option, but first mover advantage is a real thing.
And then Zeke, if a vendor, just out of curiosity, a vendor calls you up and they need to also put time and resources from their staff. How do you feel about paid trials? About somebody that is they want you to trial your product, but they want you to pay for it in order to do that?
Well, I mean, we've done paid trials before because we were really interested in the data. We knew we needed something, and a lot of times, a lot of the data vendors we work with, actually, we reached out to them. I called someone around and said, I need to look at the zinc inventories in Korea, for some trade I have on, and they said, oh, call up Fast Markets or some firm like that. So we don't have a problem with paid trials, and even the unpaid trials, still costs us a lot because we have to put all this engineering time into it. So I don't think that's such a bad idea. If the client is really interested in your product, they're gonna give it a good shot. It's a good way of filtering people out, that if you force them to pay for the trial. But I don't know, maybe
I can respectfully disagree. I don't know, Greg, if you feel. I mean, we typically prefer, obviously, not to pay for a trial. And I'd say we probably would look around and make sure there was no other vendors who had what you had before signing it. It is very resource heavy for us as well. And to Greg's point, like, it's a partnership, right? We know we're taking your time, but we're also taking our time, and hopefully it's mutually beneficial. But if it's not, we've both put time in, and there's a reason. So we certainly would push back on pretty much any kind of paid trial.
You get 3 months unpaid trial, you said earlier.
I mean, usually we can trial, depending on the data sets, we can trial them in a week. If all the stars align, right? If the researchers have the time at that moment, if the data comes in, we can get it in the form. If there's nothing missing, if we have all the documentation, I mean, it's not unheard of for us to make a decision in that short period of time. But again, the stars often don't align. And so 3 months is sort of a good benchmark by the time you get everything you need in.
I would add, in certain circumstances, we're okay paying a nominal amount for a live trial. What we would never do is pay for historic data. And usually if you have a good track record of point in time historic data, there's a lot of times we don't need the live trial. So there's very few circumstances where we actually, need to request a live trial, a paid live trial, albeit, if it's absolutely necessary to continue testing the data. But, usually we're able to do our back test if you have extended history.
Great. Good. Well, thanks so much. Thanks all three of you for joining us. That went really fast. I've got a lot of other questions, but that was wonderful. Thanks again. Please, a warm round of applause for Eliza, Zeke, and Greg. Thanks so much.